Deep in Kentucky's Tug Fork Valley, where morning mist clings to ancient ridges like the ghosts of old feuds, there's a cemetery plot that tells a story most folks would rather forget. 27 headstones bearing the same last name, all marking graves from a span of just 30 years. The dates don't lie about what happened here, but the official records do. Because when families become armies and blood becomes currency, the truth gets buried deeper than the bodies. In 1863, a Confederate deserter named Asa Harmon McCoy was gunned down in a winter ambush that would ignite the most infamous family war in American history. But here's what your history books won't tell you. The Hatfield-McCoy feud wasn't just some backwoods squabble over stolen pigs and forbidden romance. It was a calculated campaign of terror that transformed entire mountain communities into battlefields where children learned to shoot before they learned to read, where mothers taught their sons that dying for family honor was more important than living for anything else. Today, we're venturing into the blood-soaked hollows of Appalachia to uncover the deadliest family dynasties you won't believe actually existed. These weren't just feuding neighbors having property disputes. These were organized clans that built criminal empires, controlled vast territories through fear and violence, and created their own twisted codes of justice that made the Wild West look civilized by comparison. We're talking about family bloodlines so dangerous that federal marshals refused to enter their territories, where entire bloodlines were systematically exterminated, and where the body counts reached numbers that would make modern gang wars look like playground fights. The mountain isolation that defined Appalachian life created perfect conditions for these family armies to flourish. When the nearest sheriff was 3 days' ride away and federal law was just a distant concept, blood loyalty became the only law that mattered. The rugged terrain provided natural fortresses where these clans could wage their private wars for decades without interference. And the cultural traditions brought over from Scotland and Ireland with their ancient concepts of clan honor and blood vengeance found fertile ground in American soil. But what made these Appalachian families truly terrifying wasn't just their willingness to kill, it was their systematic approach to violence, their ability to maintain multi-generational conflicts that consumed entire communities, and their development of warfare tactics that would influence American crime for generations to come. The Hatfield family empire began with William Anderson Hatfield, known throughout the mountains as Devil Anse. Standing 6 feet tall, with piercing blue eyes and a beard that reached his chest, Devil Anse looked exactly like what he was, a man who had turned warfare into an art form. During the Civil War, he led a Confederate guerrilla unit called the Logan Wildcats, learning military tactics that he would later apply to his family's private conflicts. But it was after the war ended that Devil Anse truly built his kingdom. From his stronghold along the Tug Fork River, Devil Anse controlled logging operations, moonshine distribution, and coal mining rights across thousands of acres of West Virginia territory. His family compound was strategically positioned to monitor river traffic and mountain passes, with armed sentries posted at all approaches. The Hatfields didn't just live in their territory, they fortified it like a military installation. What made Devil Anse's operation so effective was his combination of legitimate business with systematic intimidation. Rival logging companies found their equipment mysteriously destroyed, their workers beaten or worse. Coal prospectors who refused to sell mineral rights to Hatfield interests had a disturbing tendency to disappear entirely. Local politicians learned quickly that opposing Hatfield business ventures could be hazardous to their health. The famous feud with the McCoys began as a business dispute disguised as a family honor conflict. Devil Anse and his brothers were expanding their timber operations into Kentucky territory controlled by the McCoy clan. What started as competition over logging rights escalated when Randolph McCoy accused Floyd Hatfield of stealing a prize hog. But this wasn't really about livestock. It was about which family would control the lucrative cross-border trade routes. The situation exploded when Rosanna McCoy began an affair with Devil Anse's son, John Hatfield. This Romeo and Juliet romance provided the perfect excuse for both families to settle their business disputes through violence. On Election Day 1882, the conflict reached its first deadly climax when three McCoy brothers cornered Ellison Hatfield during a political rally. They stabbed him 26 times before finishing him with a bullet to the chest. Devil Anse's response demonstrated the calculated brutality that made his family legendary. Rather than allowing the legal system to handle the murder, he assembled a heavily armed posse that intercepted the three McCoy brothers as they were being transported to trial. The Hatfields tied the prisoners to pawpaw trees and executed them by firing squad, but even that wasn't enough. This execution sent shockwaves throughout the region and established the Hatfields' reputation for merciless retaliation. But Devil Anse wasn't content with simple revenge. He wanted to destroy the McCoy family entirely. His campaign of terror escalated over the following years with ambushes, barn burnings, and systematic targeting of McCoy allies and business interests. The violence reached its horrific peak on New Year's Day 1888, when Devil Anse's nephew Jim Vance led a dawn raid on Randolph McCoy's cabin. The attackers surrounded the house and opened fire, killing McCoy's daughter, Alifair, and son Calvin. When Sarah McCoy tried to help her wounded children, the raiders beat her with rifle butts so severely that she never fully recovered. They then set the cabin ablaze, forcing the surviving family members to flee into the frozen wilderness. This New Year's massacre shocked even the violence-hardened mountain communities and brought national attention to the feud. But for Devil Anse, it was just business. The attack eliminated a key McCoy stronghold and sent a clear message that no one was safe from Hatfield retaliation. The psychological impact was devastating. Entire communities lived in terror, never knowing when the Hatfields might strike next. The McCoy family's response demonstrated their own capacity for organized violence. Randolph McCoy, driven half-mad by grief and rage, assembled his own army of relatives and hired gunmen. They launched retaliatory raids into West Virginia, killing Jim Vance and several other Hatfield allies. The conflict had evolved from a family feud into a small-scale war involving dozens of combatants on both sides. What made this conflict particularly dangerous was how it drew in local law enforcement and political officials. The Hatfields had bought influence with West Virginia politicians, while the McCoys had connections in Kentucky. Soon, governors from both states were involved, with militias mobilized and threats of interstate warfare. The situation became so volatile that the United States Supreme Court had to intervene to prevent an actual war between Kentucky and West Virginia. But the legal resolution didn't end the violence, it just drove it underground. Both families continued their private war through ambushes and assassinations that continued well into the 1890s. The final death toll remains disputed, but at least 12 people died directly from feud violence, with dozens more wounded or permanently displaced. The Hatfield legacy extended far beyond their famous feud with the McCoys. Devil Ance's organizational methods and territorial control tactics became a template for criminal families throughout Appalachia. His combination of legitimate business operations with systematic violence created a model that would influence organized crime for generations. Even after the official end of the feud, the Hatfield name carried such weight that business negotiations throughout the region were conducted with awareness of potential Hatfield interests. Politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials continued to tread carefully around family members, knowing that the Hatfields' capacity for organized retaliation remained intact. The psychological warfare tactics developed during the feud, the public displays of violence, the targeting of family members, the destruction of property to send messages, became standard practices for criminal organizations throughout the mountain regions. The Hatfields had demonstrated that a well-organized family could effectively challenge government authority and control territory through fear. Devil Anse himself lived until 1921, dying peacefully in his bed despite decades of violence. His funeral drew thousands of mourners and curious onlookers, testament to his legendary status in Appalachian culture. Even former enemies paid their respects, acknowledging that regardless of his methods, Devil Anse Hatfield had been a force of nature who shaped the destiny of an entire region. But the most dangerous families weren't always the most famous ones. While the Hatfield-McCoy feud captured headlines across America, deeper in the mountains, other bloodlines were writing their own chapters of terror with far deadlier consequences. These were the clans that made even hardened federal marshals think twice before entering their territory. The Martin-Toiver feud in Rowan County, Kentucky, stands as perhaps the bloodiest family conflict in American history. What started as a simple election dispute between two young men in 1884 escalated into 3 years of absolute terror that claimed 20 lives and left an entire county traumatized. Craig Tolliver emerged as the most feared feudist in Appalachian history. Standing over 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes, he possessed the rare combination of physical intimidation and calculated brutality that made him legendary. Unlike other feudists who relied on passion and revenge, Tolliver approached violence like a military campaign. The Tolliver faction didn't just kill their enemies, they systematically destroyed them. They burned homes, slaughtered livestock, and drove families from the county through pure terror. What made Craig Tolliver particularly dangerous was his intelligence. He understood that controlling information meant controlling power, so he established a network of informants throughout the region. Shopkeepers, postal workers, even deputy sheriffs fed him intelligence about his enemies' movements. This allowed the Tollivers to stay one step ahead of both their rivals and law enforcement. The Martin family, led by John Martin, found themselves hopelessly outmatched. Unlike the organized Tolliver faction, the Martins lacked strong leadership and were almost completely exterminated. The few survivors were forced to flee the county, leaving behind everything they had built over generations. But the Tollivers' reign of terror extended beyond their immediate enemies. The young family was marked for death simply because they supported the Tollivers, while the Logan family faced annihilation for backing the Martins. This demonstrated how these feuds inevitably consumed entire communities, turning neighbors against neighbors and creating atmospheres of constant fear. The final battle of the Martin-Toiver feud showcased the extreme violence that characterized these mountain wars. On June 22nd, 1887, over 100 armed men surrounded the Tollivers at a hotel in Moorhead. What followed was a 2.5-hour siege that resembled a military assault more than a typical gunfight. An estimated 2,000 shots were fired during the battle, turning the streets of Moorhead into a war zone. Craig Tolliver, the man who had terrorized an entire county, met his end running bareheaded down a street, struck down by a bullet to the legs before being finished off by the vengeful posse. The aftermath revealed the true scope of Tolliver brutality. When authorities finally secured their compound, they discovered evidence of systematic torture, makeshift prisons, and records detailing years of extortion and murder. The Tolliver faction had operated like an organized crime syndicate decades before such organizations became common in America. Even more deadly was the French Eversole feud in Perry County, Kentucky, which demonstrated how educated, wealthy men could be just as brutal as mountain farmers. Joseph Eversole and Benjamin Fulton French were both successful merchants and lawyers who had once been friends. Their conflict arose from the coal boom that was transforming Appalachia in the late 1800s. French worked for outside corporations, buying coal rights from local residents, often illiterate farmers who didn't understand the true value of what they were selling. Eversole, with deep local connections, saw this as exploitation and began warning his neighbors about French's tactics. What started as a business dispute escalated into a war that claimed at least 20 lives, though some historians believe the death toll reached as high as 74. The French Eversole feud was particularly vicious because both sides had the resources to hire professional gunmen and the intelligence to plan sophisticated attacks. Unlike typical mountain feuds that relied on ambushes and quick strikes, this conflict involved coordinated military-style operations. The assassination of Joseph Eversole marked one of the most shocking moments in Appalachian feuding history. Eversole and his young companion, Nick Combs, were found shot multiple times, with Nick's eyes deliberately shot out in an act of pure cruelty. The brutality of these murders demonstrated how the coal boom had intensified traditional mountain violence, adding economic warfare to ancient concepts of honor and revenge. The decision to bury both victims in the same coffin reflected the close bonds between feud allies and the community's recognition that they had died for a common cause. From the Reconstruction period through the early 20th century, this 500 square mile region experienced a level of sustained violence that made the Hatfield-McCoy feud look tame by comparison. In 1 year alone, 40 people died because of family alignments, creating a death rate that exceeded most active war zones. The Strong Amy feud in Breathitt County demonstrated the systematic nature of mountain violence. For 35 years, this conflict claimed exactly 1 life per year, showing how feuds could become institutionalized aspects of community life. Captain Bill Strong and John Amy became legendary figures whose very names inspired fear throughout the region. Their followers treated the annual death like a ritual sacrifice, with each side taking turns striking at their enemies. The most devastating conflict in Breathitt County involved the Hargus-Callahan Cockrell factions, a political feud that killed an estimated 320 people. James and Alexander Hargus, along with Ed Callahan, formed a criminal conspiracy that used murder and intimidation to control local politics. They didn't just want to win elections, they wanted to own the entire political system. The assassination of James B. Markham on May 4, 1903, became the most notorious incident in Breathitt County's bloody history. Markham, a respected attorney and federal commissioner, was gunned down in broad daylight on the courthouse steps by Curtis Jett and Tom White, known enforcers for the Hargus faction. The brazen nature of this murder, carried out at the very symbol of law and justice, demonstrated the complete breakdown of civilized society in eastern Kentucky. For months before his death, Markham had lived like a prisoner in his own home, afraid to venture outside even onto his porch. He used his wife and children as human shields, knowing that even the Hargus faction wouldn't risk killing innocent family members. This psychological warfare was as effective as physical violence, creating a climate of fear that paralyzed the entire community. These feuds weren't limited to Kentucky. The Howard Turner feud in Harlan County claimed 30 lives over 12 years, with property destruction through arson adding economic warfare to personal violence. Wilson Howard's eventual execution for killing a neutral party demonstrated that the feuds occasionally faced legal consequences, but only when they threatened people outside the feuding factions. The Taylor-Sutton feud in Texas showed how these conflicts could evolve beyond family disputes into broader criminal enterprises. Lasting a decade and costing at least 35 lives, this range war involved Texas Rangers, state police, and the notorious outlaw John Wesley Hardin. The participation of legendary gunfighters and law enforcement officials demonstrated how feuds could attract dangerous individuals and corrupt entire regions. What made these families truly deadly wasn't just their willingness to kill, but their ability to institutionalize violence. They created systems of terror that could persist across generations, with each new death requiring retaliation and each act of revenge justifying further violence. The mountainous terrain provided perfect cover for ambushes while making law enforcement nearly impossible. Family honor became paramount, with any slight against one member requiring blood vengeance against the entire opposing clan. The isolation of these communities meant that federal and state authorities had little influence, allowing private wars to rage unchecked for years. These feuds created their own brutal logic, where compromise became impossible and survival depended on being more ruthless than your enemies. But the most terrifying truth about these Appalachian family dynasties wasn't their violence, it was their reach. By the 1890s, these bloodlines had evolved beyond simple mountain feuds into something far more sinister. Interconnected networks of corruption that stretched their tentacles into every level of government, law enforcement, and commerce across multiple states. The French Eversole conflict perfectly illustrates this transformation from family feud to organized criminal enterprise. When Benjamin French arrived in Perry County as a representative of Northern coal interests, he encountered more than just local resistance. He faced a carefully orchestrated system where Joseph Eversole had spent decades placing family members and loyal allies in positions of power. The county clerk, 3 deputy sheriffs, the postmaster, and even the circuit judge all owed their positions to Eversole influence. This wasn't just nepotism, it was strategic control. French's assassination attempts weren't random acts of mountain violence. They were calculated strikes designed to eliminate a threat to an entire economic ecosystem built on blood loyalty and intimidation. When Nick Combs and Joe Eversole were found murdered with their eyes shot out, the brutal symbolism sent a clear message. Those who see too much, who witness what they shouldn't, face consequences that extend beyond death into deliberate desecration. The economic warfare between these factions revealed the true stakes. Coal rights worth millions of dollars in today's currency hung in the balance. The French faction represented the new industrial order, backed by unlimited northern capital and modern business practices. But the Eversole network embodied something more dangerous. Generations of accumulated local knowledge, family connections that crossed county lines, and a willingness to use terror tactics that corporate interests couldn't match. What made the French Eversole War particularly devastating was how it weaponized illiteracy against vulnerable mountain families. French's agents would arrive at isolated cabins with complex legal documents, offering immediate cash payments for mineral rights that these families couldn't read or understand. Meanwhile, Eversole's riders spread through the hollows with a different message. Any family that sold to the outsiders would face the same fate as their patriarch. Caught between corporate manipulation and family terror, dozens of innocent mountain residents found themselves trapped in a conflict that would consume their children and grandchildren. The Breathitt County situation demonstrated how these family networks could completely capture local government institutions. Judge James Hargus didn't simply win elections through violence. He created a sophisticated political machine that controlled voter registration, ballot counting, and witness intimidation with military precision. His brother Alexander's simultaneous campaign for state senate showed their ambitions extended far beyond county politics. They were building a dynasty designed to influence state-level legislation and federal appointments. Ed Callahan's role as sheriff completed their control triangle. With Hargus controlling the courts, Alexander positioned in the legislature, and Callahan commanding law enforcement, the family had effectively created their own sovereign territory within Kentucky. Citizens who opposed them faced a terrifying reality. There was no legitimate authority to appeal to, because the family had captured every institution that might provide protection or justice. The assassination of James Markham represented the ultimate expression of this institutional capture. Here was a federal commissioner, appointed by Washington and backed by federal authority, gunned down in broad daylight on courthouse steps. The message couldn't have been clearer. Even federal power meant nothing in territories controlled by these family networks. Curtis Jett and Tom White didn't just murder Markham. They executed a public demonstration that federal law was powerless against local family rule. Markham's 72-day imprisonment in his own home reveals the psychological warfare these families employed. They didn't need to kill every opponent immediately. Instead, they could destroy lives through sustained terror campaigns that left victims alive but completely neutralized. The fact that Markham used his wife and children as human shields shows how completely these tactics had broken down civilized society. When a federal law enforcement official must hide behind women and children to survive, the rule of law has ceased to exist. The Howard Turner feud in Harlan County demonstrated how these conflicts could persist across decades while maintaining their brutal intensity. 30 deaths over 10 to 12 years meant that an entire generation grew up knowing nothing but warfare between these families. Children learned to identify enemies before they could read. Teenagers planned ambushes instead of attending school. The destruction of property through systematic arson showed how these feuds targeted not just human lives, but the economic foundations of entire communities. Wilson Howard's eventual execution for killing a neutral party reveals the crucial boundary that even these lawless territories maintained. Violence between feuding families was acceptable, even expected, but attacking innocent bystanders threatened the broader social contract that allowed these conflicts to continue. His hanging demonstrated that mountain justice operated by different rules, but it still maintained certain limits that couldn't be crossed without consequences. The expansion of these conflicts beyond Appalachia proved that family-based warfare wasn't limited to isolated mountain communities. The Tut-Everett War in Arkansas showed how political ambitions could transform family rivalries into systematic campaigns of assassination and terror. The creation of Marion County provided the catalyst, but the underlying dynamics of family honor, economic competition, and territorial control drove the violence that followed. The Brooks-McFarland feud in Indian Territory illustrated how these family networks adapted to frontier conditions while maintaining their essential characteristics. The shoot-on-sight vow between these families created a state of constant warfare where normal social interactions became impossible. The gunfight at Spokane represented the inevitable culmination of such absolute hostility, with multiple deaths occurring in a single confrontation that resembled a military engagement more than a personal dispute. The Taylor-Sutton feud in Texas demonstrated the most sophisticated evolution of family warfare, involving not just local clans, but state police, Texas Rangers, and legendary outlaws like John Wesley Hardin. This conflict showed how family feuds could attract dangerous individuals from across the frontier, creating criminal networks that spanned multiple states and challenged federal authority. The 10-year duration and 35 deaths made this one of the most destructive family conflicts in American history. These families didn't just control territory through violence. They created alternative systems of law, justice, and economic organization that functioned independently of legitimate government institutions. They established their own courts, enforced their own punishments, and maintained their own military forces. In effect, they created feudal kingdoms within the American Republic, territories where family loyalty trumped federal law and blood vengeance superseded constitutional rights. The legacy of these deadly Appalachian dynasties extends far beyond their immediate victims. They established patterns of institutional corruption, family-based criminal organization, and systematic intimidation that would influence American organized crime for generations. Their methods would be studied and adapted by later criminal enterprises, from Prohibition-era bootleggers to modern drug trafficking organizations. Most disturbing of all, these families demonstrated how quickly civilized society could collapse when institutions failed to maintain their authority. In territories where federal and state power remained weak, family networks filled the vacuum with their own brutal systems of control. They proved that the rule of law isn't inevitable or permanent, but depends on constant vigilance and institutional strength to prevent its collapse into something far more primitive and deadly. Today, the mountains still remember these names, though they're spoken in whispers rather than proclamations. The descendants of these deadly dynasties have largely integrated into modern society, but the lessons of their reign remain carved into Appalachian memory. The truth is, these weren't just isolated incidents. By the 1890s, Breathitt County had become the epicenter of a criminal network that made organized crime families look like amateur hour. The Hargus clan had transformed from small-time politicians into architects of systematic terror, creating the most sophisticated criminal empire in Appalachian history. James Hargus didn't just want political power, he wanted complete control, and he was willing to kill anyone who stood in his way. What made the Hargus family particularly dangerous wasn't just their brutality, but their intelligence. They understood that true power came from controlling the entire system, not just winning elections. The Hargus network infiltrated every aspect of county life. They had judges on their payroll, sheriffs who answered to them, and businessmen who paid protection money or faced mysterious fires. Court records show they controlled the local newspaper, ensuring their version of events was the only one published. They even had informants in neighboring counties, creating an intelligence network that would have impressed federal agencies. Their method of maintaining control was both systematic and terrifying. The Hargus family established what they called the accounting system. Every slight, every insult, every act of defiance was recorded in detailed ledgers. These weren't just records of debts and payments, but meticulous documentation of who owed what kind of retribution. Family members would regularly review these books, planning their revenge with the precision of military strategists. When someone crossed the Hargus family, they didn't just face immediate retaliation. They faced a campaign of psychological warfare designed to break them completely. The family would target not just the individual, but their entire network of relationships. Business partners would mysteriously withdraw their support. Credit would dry up. Family members would receive anonymous threats. The message was clear. Opposing the Hargus family meant destroying not just yourself, but everyone you cared about. The execution of their enemies was equally calculated. The Hargus family pioneered what became known as the mountain disappearance. Rather than simply killing opponents, they would make them vanish in ways that left families wondering for years whether their loved ones were dead or alive. Bodies would be disposed of in abandoned mine shafts or remote caves, ensuring they would never be found. The uncertainty was often more devastating than confirmed death, as families couldn't grieve properly or seek justice. Their political corruption reached levels that shocked even seasoned observers. During the 1900 election, the Hargus family didn't just stuff ballot boxes or intimidate voters. They created an entirely fictional electorate. Dead people voted. People who had moved away years earlier somehow cast ballots. The same person voted multiple times under different names. When investigators tried to verify voter rolls, they discovered that entire precincts contained more votes than residents. The family's business empire was equally corrupt. They controlled timber operations, mining claims, and merchant businesses through a combination of legitimate ownership and criminal coercion. Competitors faced systematic sabotage. Equipment would mysteriously break down, shipments would disappear, workers would receive threatening messages. Those who refused to sell their businesses to the Hargus family often found their properties burned to the ground. Their moonshine operation during the later years demonstrated their evolution from local thugs to sophisticated criminals. The Hargus family established distribution networks that reached major cities across the eastern United States. They used coded telegrams to coordinate shipments, maintained safe houses along transportation routes, and even corrupted federal revenue agents to protect their operations. Their mountain distilleries were engineering marvels, hidden in caves and disguised as legitimate businesses. What made the Hargus family truly terrifying was their ability to corrupt the very institutions meant to stop them. They didn't just bribe officials, they created a parallel system of justice where their word was law. They held their own trials, complete with witnesses and evidence, before executing their enemies. These proceedings were conducted with all the formality of legitimate courts, creating a twisted legitimacy for their actions. The psychological impact of their reign extended far beyond their immediate victims. Entire communities still lived in constant fear, never knowing when they might inadvertently cross the family or become collateral damage in one of their feuds. Parents taught their children never to mention the Hargus name in public. Merchants kept detailed records of every transaction, knowing that any discrepancy might be interpreted as theft. Teachers avoided discussing politics or current events, understanding that the wrong comment could mark them for elimination. Their network of informants created a climate of paranoia that poisoned social relationships throughout the region. Neighbors suspected neighbors of reporting to the Hargus family. Friends betrayed friends to protect themselves. The traditional mountain values of loyalty and mutual aid collapsed under the weight of systematic terror. Community gatherings became rare, as people feared that any gathering might be interpreted as conspiracy against the family. The Hargus family also demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of media manipulation that was decades ahead of its time. They cultivated relationships with sympathetic journalists, ensuring favorable coverage of their activities. When negative stories appeared, the reporters often faced mysterious accidents or decided to relocate suddenly. The family understood that controlling information was as important as controlling territory. Their influence extended into religious institutions as well. Several preachers received generous donations from the Hargus family, and their sermons began emphasizing themes of divine justice and the importance of respecting authority. Churches that refused to cooperate found their buildings vandalized or their congregations intimidated. The family understood that spiritual authority could be as powerful as political or economic control. The international implications of their criminal empire were staggering. The Hargus family established connections with criminal organizations in major cities, creating partnerships that would influence organized crime for decades to come. Their methods of territorial control, systematic intimidation, and institutional corruption became templates that other criminal organizations would adopt and refine. Their downfall came not from law enforcement, but from their own success. The Hargus family became so powerful that they attracted federal attention at a time when the government was beginning to assert its authority in previously lawless regions. The Spanish-American War had demonstrated federal capability to project power, and progressive politicians were demanding action against local corruption. The final confrontation involved over 300 federal agents, state militia, and local law enforcement officers who had been secretly recruited from outside the region. The operation required months of planning and coordination between multiple agencies. Even then, several key family members escaped, taking their criminal expertise to other regions where they established new operations. The legacy of the Hargus family extends far beyond their immediate crimes. They demonstrated how criminal organizations could evolve from simple violence to sophisticated systems of control that rivaled legitimate governments. Their methods influenced the development of organized crime throughout the 20th century, providing blueprints for territorial control and institutional corruption that criminal organizations still use today. But perhaps their most chilling legacy was the demonstration of how quickly civilized society could collapse when criminal organizations gained sufficient power. The Hargus family showed that American institutions, despite their strength, were vulnerable to systematic corruption, and that entire regions could be held hostage by sufficiently organized and ruthless criminals. The mountains of eastern Kentucky still bear the scars of their reign. Local families still whisper stories of the Hargus years, passing down warnings about the danger of unchecked power and the importance of maintaining legitimate institutions. The abandoned buildings and overgrown cemeteries serve as monuments to a time when criminal families ruled like medieval lords, answerable to no law but their own twisted sense of justice. These weren't just hillbilly criminals or simple mountain feuds. The deadliest Appalachian families created criminal empires that challenged the very foundations of American law and order. They demonstrated that in the absence of effective government, the most ruthless and organized groups would inevitably seize power, creating their own brutal systems of control that could persist for generations. The story of these families serves as a stark reminder that civilization is more fragile than we often imagine, and that the rule of law requires constant vigilance to maintain. The deadliest of these Appalachian bloodlines, however, weren't satisfied with simple murder and intimidation. Deep in the most isolated hollows, where federal marshals feared to venture and state authority held no sway, certain families developed practices that went far beyond conventional violence. These clans didn't just kill their enemies, they systematically dismantled their very existence, erasing entire bloodlines from history while establishing criminal empires that would influence organized crime patterns for generations to come. The most terrifying aspect of these families wasn't their body count, though the numbers were staggering. It was their ability to corrupt every institution they touched, transforming entire counties into feudal territories where their word was absolute law. They didn't just break the system, they replaced it entirely with their own brutal hierarchy of blood, fear, and unwavering loyalty. What made these clans particularly dangerous was their sophisticated understanding of power structures. Unlike common criminals who operated in the shadows, these families openly controlled local governments, law enforcement, and judicial systems. They appointed sheriffs, bought judges, and intimidated juries with such systematic efficiency that justice became whatever served their interests. County courthouses became extensions of their criminal enterprises, with legal proceedings serving as elaborate theater to legitimize their reign of terror. The economic impact of these families extended far beyond their immediate territories. They controlled critical resources, coal mines, timber operations, and transportation routes that were essential to the region's development. By manipulating these assets through violence and intimidation, they could influence markets across multiple states. Railroad companies paid tribute to ensure safe passage through their territories. Mining corporations found their operations mysteriously plagued by accidents until appropriate arrangements were made. Timber merchants discovered that trees could only be harvested with family permission, regardless of legal ownership. Their influence on early American organized crime cannot be overstated. The hierarchical structures, codes of silence, and territorial control methods pioneered by these Appalachian families became templates for criminal organizations nationwide. The concept of protection rackets, the systematic corruption of law enforcement, and the use of legitimate businesses to launder criminal proceeds. All of these tactics were refined in the mountains of Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia decades before they appeared in major cities. The psychological warfare employed by these families was perhaps their most innovative contribution to criminal methodology. They understood that fear was more effective than violence, though they were certainly capable of both. Public displays of brutality served specific purposes, not just to eliminate enemies, but to send messages to entire communities about the consequences of resistance. Bodies were left in particular locations, arranged in specific ways, or accompanied by symbolic objects that conveyed clear warnings to anyone who discovered them. Their recruitment methods were equally sophisticated. Rather than relying solely on blood relations, these families actively cultivated networks of allies, informants, and enforcers throughout their territories. They offered protection to vulnerable families in exchange for loyalty, provided economic opportunities to those willing to serve their interests, and systematically eliminated potential rivals before they could pose threats. Children from allied families were often raised alongside blood relatives, creating bonds of loyalty that transcended traditional kinship structures. The corruption of religious institutions represented another dimension of their control. Several of these families established their own churches or co-opted existing congregations, using religious authority to justify their actions and maintain community compliance. Sermons would include subtle endorsements of family activities, while church gatherings provided opportunities for intelligence collection and the identification of potential threats. The blending of religious and criminal authority created a powerful psychological hold over their territories that persisted long after the original leaders were dead or imprisoned. Their impact on regional development was profound and lasting. Areas under their control experienced stunted economic growth, as legitimate businesses were either absorbed into criminal enterprises or driven away entirely. Educational opportunities were deliberately limited to maintain population control, and prevent the emergence of potential challengers. Infrastructure development was selectively implemented to serve criminal purposes rather than community needs. Roads were built to facilitate smuggling operations. Communication systems were designed to support criminal intelligence networks, and public facilities were positioned to enhance territorial control. The legacy of these families extends into modern American criminal justice. Many of the investigative techniques, witness protection protocols, and federal intervention strategies developed to combat organized crime were first tested against these Appalachian clans. The difficulties federal authorities encountered in penetrating their organizations led to innovations in undercover operations, electronic surveillance, and interagency cooperation that became standard law enforcement practices. Perhaps most disturbing was their ability to maintain popular support within their territories despite their criminal activities. Through a combination of economic dependency, cultural manipulation, and strategic violence, they convinced entire communities that their rule was preferable to outside authority. They positioned themselves as protectors of local traditions against federal interference, champions of mountain independence against urban corruption, and providers of stability in an uncertain world. This manufactured legitimacy allowed them to operate with impunity for decades, secure in the knowledge that their own people would never betray them. The environmental destruction caused by their criminal enterprises left scars on the Appalachian landscape that remain visible today. Illegal mining operations stripped mountains bare without regard for restoration. Timber harvesting eliminated old-growth forests that had stood for centuries. Chemical waste from moonshine production contaminated water sources throughout their territories. The human cost was matched by ecological devastation that fundamentally altered the region's natural heritage. These families represented something far more dangerous than common criminals. They were builders of shadow governments, creators of parallel societies where traditional American values and institutions held no authority. They proved that in the right circumstances, criminal organizations could establish effective control over significant territories and populations, challenging the very foundations of democratic governance. Their success demonstrated the fragility of civilization in remote areas where federal authority was weak and local institutions could be corrupted or co-opted. The complete story of these deadliest Appalachian families may never be fully told. Too many records were destroyed, too many witnesses silenced, too many secrets buried with their keepers. But the true horror wasn't the violence itself. It was how these families transformed murder into a sophisticated business model that corrupted entire regions for generations. What we've uncovered reveals that the deadliest Appalachian clans didn't just kill their enemies, they systematically dismantled the very concept of law and order, replacing it with their own brutal codes of justice that still echo through these mountains today. The most chilling aspect of these family dynasties was their ability to institutionalize violence. Take the Hargus political machine in Breathitt County. James Hargus didn't just kill his opponents, he created an entire shadow government where murder was policy. His organization controlled judges, sheriffs, tax collectors, and even postal workers. When someone crossed the Hargus family, they weren't just facing individual revenge, they were challenging an entire criminal state within a state. This systematic approach to violence created what historians now call the Appalachian terror model. Unlike random acts of brutality, these families operated with the efficiency of military organizations. They maintained detailed intelligence networks, planned operations months in advance, and executed coordinated campaigns that eliminated not just individuals, but entire bloodlines. The Tolliver faction's methodical extermination of the Martin family demonstrated this approach perfectly. They didn't just kill Mart family members, they systematically hunted down anyone with Martin blood, their allies, their business partners, and even people who had shown them kindness. The economic impact of these family wars extended far beyond the immediate victims. These clans controlled the flow of resources throughout entire counties. The Hatfields dominated logging operations along the Tug Fork, setting prices and determining which companies could operate in their territory. Cross them, and your timber operations would face mysterious accidents, equipment sabotage, and workers who suddenly refused to show up for fear of their lives. The McCoys controlled key river crossings and mountain passes, essentially taxing anyone who wanted to move goods through their domain. But perhaps most disturbing was how these families corrupted the legal system itself. They didn't just operate outside the law, they became the law. In Rowan County, Craig Tolliver appointed himself as a deputy sheriff, giving his reign of terror official sanction. When he walked into Moorhead's main street, armed with multiple weapons, he wasn't just a criminal, he was a law enforcement officer. This perversion of justice meant that victims had nowhere to turn. The very people sworn to protect them were the ones hunting them down. The psychological warfare these families employed was equally sophisticated. The French Eversole feud demonstrated how these clans used terror to control entire populations. They would leave threatening messages written in blood on church doors. They would place the severed heads of livestock on the porches of families they wanted to intimidate. They understood that one public execution could prevent a dozen potential challenges to their authority. These families also mastered the art of collective punishment. When someone wronged a member of the Shepherd clan, they didn't just target the individual, they destroyed everyone connected to that person. Family members, employees, friends, and even people who lived in the same hollow would face retaliation. This created a climate where entire communities would ostracize anyone who might provoke these dangerous families, effectively making the population complicit in their own oppression. The religious corruption these families practiced was particularly twisted. The Baker family created their own cult that mixed Christian imagery with pagan ritual and criminal activity. They convinced desperate followers that God had chosen them to survive the apocalypse, and that stealing from and murdering outsiders was divinely sanctioned. This religious justification for violence created fanatically loyal followers who would commit any atrocity believing they were doing God's work. The intergenerational nature of these conflicts created a unique form of inherited trauma. Children born into feuding families were raised from birth to hate specific bloodlines. They learned to shoot before they could read. They memorized the faces of their enemies before they knew their own extended family. This systematic indoctrination of children turned the feuds into self-perpetuating cycles of violence that could continue for decades after the original cause of conflict had been forgotten. What made these families particularly dangerous was their ability to adapt to changing times. As the frontier period ended and federal law enforcement grew stronger, they evolved their operations. The Johnson family of Blood Creek transformed from simple mountain bandits into sophisticated criminal entrepreneurs who used automobiles, airplanes, and modern communication to run operations across multiple states. They understood that survival required innovation, and they were always one step ahead of law enforcement. The environmental destruction these families caused was equally devastating. Their control of resource extraction led to catastrophic deforestation, strip mining, and water pollution that poisoned entire watersheds. The Thornton Coal Empire left behind a landscape of poisoned streams, collapsed mine shafts, and contaminated soil that still affects communities today. They extracted maximum profit with no regard for long-term consequences, creating environmental disasters that persist more than a century later. These criminal dynasties also pioneered many techniques that would later be adopted by organized crime syndicates. Their use of intimidation, corruption of public officials, territorial control, and systematic elimination of rivals became the template for later criminal organizations. The methods developed in the isolated hollows of Appalachia would eventually spread to major cities, influencing the development of American organized crime. The most frightening legacy of these families was how they normalized extreme violence in their communities. Generations of children grew up believing that murder was an acceptable solution to disputes. They learned that the strongest family ruled, and that showing mercy was a sign of weakness that would be exploited by enemies. This cultural acceptance of violence created communities where brutality was not just tolerated but expected. Even today, the influence of these deadly dynasties can be felt throughout Appalachia. Many of the region's ongoing problems with drug trafficking, political corruption, and endemic violence can be traced back to the criminal traditions these families established. They created a culture where might makes right, where official law enforcement is viewed with suspicion, and where family loyalty trumps all other considerations. The deadliest Appalachian families weren't just criminals, they were architects of chaos who transformed entire regions into kingdoms of terror. Their legacy reminds us how quickly civilization can collapse when violence becomes institutionalized, and how the scars of systematic brutality can persist for generations. The legacy of these deadly Appalachian families extends far beyond their immediate reign of terror, weaving itself into the very fabric of modern organized crime and institutional corruption. What makes their influence so chilling is how their methods didn't disappear with their deaths. They evolved, adapted, and spread like a virus through the bloodstream of American society. The Hatfield-McCoy feud may be remembered as folklore today, but the tactical innovations they pioneered became the blueprint for territorial control that organized crime families would perfect decades later. Their use of family loyalty as an unbreakable bond, their sophisticated intelligence networks that penetrated law enforcement, and their ability to maintain public sympathy while conducting private wars. These weren't primitive mountain tactics. They were advanced psychological warfare techniques that modern criminal enterprises still employ. Consider how the Hargus political machine in Breathitt County operated. They didn't just control through violence, they controlled through systematic corruption, placing their people in every level of government, from judges to sheriffs to county clerks. This model of institutional capture became the foundation for how organized crime would later infiltrate major American cities. The difference was scale, not methods. Where the Hargus family controlled 3 counties, later criminal organizations would control entire metropolitan areas using identical techniques. The economic strategies these families developed were equally sophisticated. The French Eversole conflict over coal rights demonstrated an early understanding of resource monopolization that would later characterize industrial racketeering. They weren't just fighting over land, they were fighting over the future economic development of entire regions. The winner would control not just the immediate profits, but the infrastructure, the jobs, the political influence that came with industrial development. What's particularly disturbing is how these families created what modern criminologists call shadow governments, parallel institutions that provided their own justice, their own protection, their own economic systems. Citizens in their territories often found family law more reliable than federal law, family protection more effective than police protection, family justice more swift than court justice. This created a dependency that lasted generations, with communities becoming psychologically as well as economically trapped within these criminal ecosystems. The psychological warfare these families pioneered was perhaps their most lasting contribution to criminal methodology. The practice of leaving personal items from victims at family homes, the public display of bodies as warnings, the systematic terrorization of entire communities. These tactics were designed not just to eliminate specific threats, but to create a climate of fear that made resistance psychologically impossible. Modern organized crime groups still use these same psychological principles, understanding that fear is more effective than violence, and the threat of violence more powerful than violence itself. The feuding families also perfected something that modern criminal enterprises have refined into an art form: the ability to appear legitimate while conducting illegal operations. The Thornton family's transition from coal mining to renewable energy demonstrates how criminal organizations adapt to changing social and economic conditions while maintaining their core power structures. They weren't just criminals, they were businessmen, community leaders, employers. This dual identity made them nearly impossible to prosecute because removing them would devastate the legitimate economy of entire regions. Perhaps most chilling is how these families understood the power of multi-generational thinking. While law enforcement focused on individual crimes and immediate prosecutions, the feuding families were building institutions designed to last centuries. They created cultures where violence was normalized, where loyalty to family superseded loyalty to law, where economic success justified any methods. Children born into these systems didn't choose criminal life. They were born into it, raised in it, and saw no alternative to it. The environmental and social damage these families inflicted on Appalachian communities created wounds that never fully healed. Counties that experienced major feuds show statistical patterns of violence, poverty, and institutional distrust that persist to this day. The feuds didn't just kill individuals, they killed social trust, economic development, educational advancement. They created cultures of suspicion where cooperation became dangerous, where success attracted deadly attention, where the safest strategy was isolation and silence. Modern law enforcement agencies studying organized crime patterns have identified what they call feuding family DNA in criminal organizations across America. The same loyalty structures, the same territorial thinking, the same willingness to engage in multi generational conflicts over perceived slights. Urban gangs, rural drug networks, white collar criminal conspiracies, they all show tactical and organizational similarities to the feuding families of 19th century Appalachia. The technology may have changed, but the fundamental dynamics remain identical. Where feuding families used rifles and horses, modern criminal organizations use encrypted communications and international banking. Where they controlled mountain passes, modern groups control supply chains and distribution networks. Where they corrupted local sheriffs, modern organizations corrupt federal agents and international officials. The scale expanded, but the methodology remained remarkably consistent. What makes this legacy particularly dangerous is how it normalized violence as a problem-solving mechanism in American culture. The feuding families didn't just kill their enemies, they created a cultural narrative where violence was heroic, where revenge was noble, where family loyalty justified any crime. This narrative spread far beyond Appalachia, influencing everything from Western movies to urban gang culture to corporate boardroom tactics. The judicial system's inability to effectively prosecute these families also created lasting damage to American legal institutions. Communities that watched federal marshals flee from feuding families, that saw judges corrupted or intimidated, that witnessed entire legal proceedings manipulated by criminal influence. These communities developed a cynicism about justice that persists generations later. When law fails repeatedly, people stop believing in law. When institutions prove corrupt, people stop trusting institutions. The feuding families understood something that modern criminologists are only beginning to appreciate, that in isolated communities, whoever controls information controls reality. They created their own newspapers, their own schools, their own churches, their own historical narratives. Children growing up in these communities learned a version of history where the family's violence was defensive, where their enemies were aggressors, where law enforcement represented outside oppression rather than public safety. This information control became a model for how criminal organizations manipulate community perception. They don't just commit crimes and hide, they create alternative narratives where their crimes become community service, where their victims deserved punishment, where their violence protects rather than threatens community safety. The feuding families were among the first American criminal organizations to understand that controlling the story is more important than controlling the territory. The economic impact of these families extended far beyond their immediate victims. Insurance companies stopped providing coverage in feuding territories. Banks refused to make loans. Businesses relocated to safer regions. Infrastructure development ceased. Federal programs were suspended. Entire counties became economic dead zones, their potential stunted by the presence of families whose violent reputations made normal commerce impossible. This pattern of criminal organizations destroying local economies while enriching themselves became a template that modern organized crime follows religiously. They understand that a thriving legitimate economy creates too many alternatives to criminal employment, too much official oversight, too much community confidence in legal institutions. Keeping communities poor, desperate and dependent makes them easier to control and exploit. The feuding families also pioneered techniques of police and political corruption that remain textbook examples for criminal organizations worldwide. They understood that buying officials was more effective than fighting them, that compromising authority figures created more lasting control than intimidating them. They developed sophisticated intelligence networks within law enforcement agencies, often knowing about planned raids and investigations before the agencies themselves had finalized their plans. The cultural mythology surrounding these families, the romanticization of their violence, the admiration for their loyalty, the respect for their defiance of authority, created a template for how criminal organizations manage their public image. They weren't just killers, they were folk heroes, protecting their communities from outside interference, maintaining traditional values against modernizing forces, standing up for family honor against institutional indifference. This mythology proved remarkably durable and exportable. Urban criminal organizations adopted the same narrative strategies, presenting themselves as community protectors rather than community predators. International criminal syndicates use similar propaganda techniques, claiming to defend traditional cultures against globalization, local interests against foreign influence, family values against social decay. The investigation techniques law enforcement developed to combat feuding families also became foundational methods for fighting organized crime. The use of informants, the penetration of family networks, the financial investigation of seemingly legitimate businesses, the coordination between federal and local agencies. All these tactics were first developed and refined in the mountains of Appalachia while fighting families whose criminal enterprises seemed impossible to penetrate or prosecute. Yet perhaps the most lasting and troubling legacy of these families is how they demonstrated the fragility of civilized society. In regions where federal authority was weak, where local institutions were corrupt, where economic opportunities were scarce, family loyalty and violence became more reliable than law and justice. They showed how quickly communities could revert to feudal power structures when legitimate authority failed to provide security and prosperity. This lesson resonates powerfully in our current era, where institutional trust continues declining, where economic inequality continues widening, where political polarization continues intensifying. The feuding families of Appalachia offer a dark preview of what American society might become if our legal, economic, and political institutions continue weakening. They remind us that civilization is not a permanent achievement, but a fragile construction that requires constant maintenance and defense. The deadliest Appalachian families may have disappeared from newspaper headlines, but their influence continues shaping American crime, American culture, and American institutions. They created templates for violence, corruption, and social control that criminal organizations still follow. They established patterns of institutional manipulation that corrupt officials still employ. They demonstrated techniques of community control that authoritarian movements still study and implement. Their legacy serves as both historical fascination and contemporary warning. In understanding how these families gained power, maintained control, and influenced generations, we better understand the ongoing threats to democratic society, the continuing challenges of law enforcement, and the persistent appeal of violent solutions to social problems. The mountains may have claimed their bodies, but their methods remain very much alive, adapted and refined for new circumstances, but fundamentally unchanged in their brutal effectiveness. The story of Appalachia's deadliest families is ultimately a story about power, how it's gained, how it's maintained, and how it corrupts everything it touches. Their blood-soaked legacy continues echoing through American society, a reminder that in the absence of justice, vengeance fills the void, and in the absence of law, violence becomes the ultimate arbiter of human disputes.